Sometimes, the smallest act in a war is the one that changes everything. Texas, summer of 1944, the heat didn't just sit in the air, it pressed down, thick and unmoving, like a weight you carried in your lungs, and on the Turner Ranch, 40 miles outside Abilene, dinner was already going wrong before anyone said a word. The skillet smoked too hard, the beef had gone dry, and the men around the long wooden table ate without looking at each other, forks scraping plates in a slow, steady rhythm. No complaints, no praise, just silence that stretched longer than it should. Jack Turner stood at the end of the table, sleeves rolled, dust still on his boots from the north pasture, chewing without tasting, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the open window where the horizon shimmered in waves of heat. He had run this place for 20 years, through droughts, through good seasons, through war, and he knew the difference between a bad meal and a bad feeling. This was the second kind, across the yard. Beyond the fence line that marked the temporary quarters, 6 German women sat on wooden steps in the fading light, their gray uniforms washed thin from use, their posture straight even in rest. They spoke quietly among themselves in a language that didn't belong to this land. Their voices carried just enough to remind the ranch hands that the war wasn't as far away as the newspapers claimed. Anna Weiss sat at the edge of the group, hands folded in her lap, watching the house, not with curiosity, not even with fear, but with a kind of still attention, the kind that measured everything and revealed nothing. She had been a nurse once, in a field hospital far from here, where decisions were made in seconds and mistakes stayed with you forever. Now she said very little, did her assigned work, and kept her distance, the way someone does when they understand that survival sometimes means becoming invisible. Inside, one of the younger cowboys pushed his plate away, not finished, just done. The sound of the chair legs dragging against the floor cut through the room sharper than any complaint could have. Jack noticed, he noticed everything. But he didn't say a word, because words had a way of turning small things into larger ones. And out here, control mattered. After a while, the men stood, one by one, hats lifted, chairs pushed back, boots thudding against wood as they stepped out into the evening, leaving behind half-eaten food and a table that felt heavier than it should. Jack stayed where he was for a moment longer, staring at what was left. Then he reached for the skillet, scraped what remained into a tin pan. The motion slow, deliberate, like he was trying to understand where it had gone wrong. Outside, Anna watched him through the open doorway, the angle of his shoulders, the way he moved, the silence around him. She didn't need to taste the food to know. She had seen this before, not here, not like this. But the pattern was the same. Something small, something overlooked, something that no one wanted to fix because it wasn't worth the trouble. Except sometimes it was. She stood up without announcing it. The other women glanced at her but didn't ask. She brushed the dust from her skirt, crossed the yard at a measured pace, each step steady despite the eyes that followed her. The line between prisoner and worker, between enemy and something else, stretched thin in that moment, and she stopped just short of the doorway, not entering, not retreating, just there, present. Jack turned slightly, aware of her before he fully looked, and for a brief second either of them spoke. The air between them held that same weight as the heat, unspoken, unmoving, and then, in a voice quiet enough that it didn't challenge, but clear enough that it couldn't be ignored, she said, "I can fix this." Jack did not answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked this time, not as a prisoner, not as a worker assigned by the army, but as someone standing in his doorway speaking like she belonged there. The kind of look that measured risk without needing words, the kind of pause that stretched just long enough to matter. The skillet in his hand still warm, the smell of overcooked beef hanging in the air between them, and somewhere behind him, the quiet echo of chairs scraping the floor still lingered like a question no one had asked out loud. "It is not your kitchen," he said finally, his voice steady, not harsh, but firm enough to remind her where she stood. Anna did not step back, did not lower her eyes, she simply nodded once, as if she had expected that answer, as if it changed nothing. "No," she said, her accent soft but clear. "But it can be better." There was no defiance in her tone, no plea either, just a statement, simple and direct, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze shifting past her for a moment to the yard, to the men moving in the distance, to the fading light settling over the ranch, and then back to her. He had seen confidence before, loud, careless, the kind that broke under pressure, but this was not that. This was something quieter, something that did not ask for permission so much as offer a result, and that made it harder to dismiss. "You cook," he said at last, setting the skillet down with a soft metal sound. "I watch." Anna inclined her head once more. A small motion, almost formal, and stepped inside, not hesitating, not rushing, just moving with the same measured pace she had carried across the yard. The kitchen felt different the moment she entered, not warmer, not brighter, just sharper somehow, as if everything had come into focus. She moved to the counter, her hands steady as she gathered what remained: the ground beef, the onions, a small tin of salt, a heel of bread that had gone stale in the dry air. She did not ask where anything was. She found it, adjusted, adapted, the way someone does when they have learned to work with whatever is left. Jack leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching. The room filled with small sounds: the scrape of a knife against wood, the soft tear of bread as she broke it into pieces, the low crackle as the stove came back to life, each motion precise, economical, no wasted movement, no hesitation. Like a rhythm she carried from somewhere else, somewhere far from Texas. She mixed the ingredients with her hands, not rushing, pressing, folding, shaping, the motion almost absent of thought, as if memory lived in her fingers. And for a brief second, something changed in the air, not visible, not spoken, but felt. Jack noticed it without knowing why, the way the silence shifted, no longer heavy, but expectant. Anna formed the mixture into small rounds, each one nearly identical, lined them carefully, then set them into the pan. The sound that followed was different this time, not the harsh burn of before, but a steady, controlled sizzle, the kind that held its shape, that promised something instead of warning against it. She adjusted the heat without looking at the knobs, listening instead, the way a musician listens for pitch, and Jack found himself uncrossing his arms without realizing it, stepping just slightly closer, not enough to be noticed, but enough to see more clearly. The smell began to change, slowly at first, then with quiet certainty, the sharpness fading, replaced by something deeper, richer, something that did not belong to this place, and yet filled it as if it always had. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say, not yet, only the sound of the pan, the movement of her hands, and the space between them narrowing without either one acknowledging it. By the time the last of the meatballs settled into the pan, the kitchen no longer smelled like a mistake. It smelled like something intentional, something built with care instead of rushed through obligation, the kind of smell that reached beyond walls, that slipped through open windows and carried across the yard without asking permission. Outside, one of the cowboys slowed his step without knowing why. Another turned his head slightly, mid-conversation, the words fading before they finished. And then, one by one, they began drifting back, not called, not ordered, just pulled by something they could not quite name. Boots heavy against the dirt, hats low against the evening sun, the long table inside still scattered with plates that had not been cleared, the quiet from before now replaced with a different kind of silence, one that waited instead of avoided. Jack remained near the doorway, watching Anna as she worked. He had stopped pretending this was just about food. There was something else happening here, something he could feel but not yet explain. She moved with the same calm precision, turning each piece at exactly the right moment, adjusting heat with a small motion of her wrist, no wasted effort, no hesitation, and when she finally stepped back, it was not with pride, not with expectation, just a quiet completion, as if the result spoke for itself. She reached for a plate, arranged the meatballs without decoration, without excess, then set it down at the center of the table and stepped aside, not leaving, not claiming space, just present. The first man to enter paused when he saw her standing there, then looked at Jack, not asking out loud but waiting for something, a signal, a permission. Jack gave none. He simply nodded once toward the table, the gesture small, almost invisible, but enough. The cowboy stepped forward, picked up a fork, and took a bite, the motion slow, cautious, like testing something unfamiliar. His jaw moved once, then again, and then he stopped. Not frozen, not shocked, just still, as if his body had paused. Before his mind could catch up, another man stepped in, then another, each one repeating the same quiet ritual, a bite, a pause, a look that shifted just slightly from uncertainty to something else, something closer to recognition. No one spoke, the room filled with the soft sounds of eating, but the rhythm had changed, slower now, deliberate, the scrape of forks no longer impatient, but measured, like each movement carried weight. Jack watched them all, but his attention returned again and again to Anna. She did not react, did not smile, did not search their faces for approval. She simply stood where she had been, hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, but her presence unmistakable. One of the younger cowboys set his fork down halfway through, not because he was finished, but because he needed to say something. He looked at the plate, then at Jack, then finally at Anna. "What is this?" he asked, the question simple, almost quiet, but it landed in the room. With more force than any raised voice could have, Anna met his gaze, steady, unhurried. "From where I come from," she said. "We make it when we want people to stay." The words were not dramatic, not delivered for effect, but they settled into the space between them with a weight that no one ignored. Outside, the last light of the day stretched long across the ranch, and inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not completely, but enough that no one in that room would mistake it for what had been there before. No one reached for the last piece right away, not because they were full, but because something in the room had changed and no one wanted to be the one to disturb it. The plates were nearly empty now, the earlier silence replaced with a quieter kind of attention, the kind that lingered instead of avoided. One of the men leaned back in his chair, wiping his hands slowly on a cloth, his eyes still on the table as if trying to understand what had just happened without saying it out loud. Another picked up his fork again, not to eat, but to turn it in his fingers, the metal catching the last of the light from the window. Jack remained standing, his position unchanged, but his posture no longer carried the same distance. He was closer now without stepping forward, watching not just the men, but the way they moved, the way they did not rush to leave this time, the way no one pushed their chair back too quickly. Outside, the evening had settled into that quiet hour where the air cooled just enough to breathe easier, and the sounds of the ranch softened into something steady and familiar. Inside, Anna stepped back from the table once the last plate had been cleared, not by her, but by the men themselves, one of them gathering dishes without being asked, another carrying them to the sink, small actions that would have gone unnoticed any other day, but now felt deliberate, almost careful. As if something unspoken had set a new order in place, Anna moved toward the doorway, not waiting, not seeking acknowledgement, just returning to where she had come from. But before she reached the threshold, Jack spoke, not loud, not commanding, just enough to stop her without breaking the moment. "You learned that where?" he asked, his voice steady, but different now, less guarded. Anna turned slightly, not fully facing him, just enough to answer. "At home," she said, and for a second, the words seemed to carry more weight than the room could hold. Jack nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if the answer explained more than it appeared to. He did not ask anything else, did not need to. The question had already shifted into something else entirely, something that did not belong to him alone. Outside, the other women watched as Anna crossed the yard, their eyes following her in silence, not questioning, not interrupting, just observing, the way they had learned to do in places where speaking too soon could change everything. She sat down where she had been before, hands resting again in her lap, her expression unchanged, but something in her stillness had deepened, as if the act itself had settled into her rather than passed through her. The men remained inside longer than usual, no one rushing to the bunkhouse, no one stepping out to smoke or stretch or escape the heat. Instead they stayed, moving slower, speaking less. The earlier rhythm of the ranch interrupted in a way that did not feel like disruption, but adjustment, and then, from the distance, the sound came, low at first, then clearer, the engine of a vehicle approaching along the dirt road, unfamiliar at this hour, not part of the ranch's routine. Jack heard it before anyone else reacted, his head turning slightly toward the sound, his expression shifting not into concern, but into something more focused, more alert. The kind of awareness that came from years of knowing that quiet moments rarely stayed that way for long. The men noticed next, their movements slowing again, not out of confusion, but recognition. The sound of authority carried differently, even before it arrived. Anna did not look up right away, she remained still for a second longer, as if holding on to the last piece of something that had just been created, and then, slowly, she lifted her gaze toward the road. The dust rising in the distance catching the fading light, and without anyone saying it. Without anyone needing to explain, the room, the yard, the entire ranch seemed to understand at the same time. Something had been seen, and now, something was coming. The vehicle came into view slowly, not rushing, not hesitant, just certain, its tires pressing into the dry Texas road with a sound that carried farther than it should have, a government jeep, dust trailing behind it in a low cloud that caught the last light of the evening and turned it into something almost golden. But there was nothing warm about the feeling it brought with it. Jack stepped out onto the porch before it reached the gate, his boots steady against the wood. His eyes fixed on the road as if measuring the distance not in miles, but in consequences. Behind him, the men had stopped moving entirely now, no one picking up tools, no one speaking, just standing in that quiet awareness that comes when something official arrives unannounced. Across the yard, Anna remained seated for 1 second longer than the others expected, then rose with the same calm she had carried all evening, her posture straight, her hands still, the other women watching her not for instruction, but for confirmation, and when she stood, they followed, not in formation, not in fear, just in a shared understanding that whatever was coming belonged to all of them now. The jeep slowed as it approached the house, then came to a stop just short of the fence, the engine idling for a moment before cutting off, leaving behind a silence that felt sharper than before. A man stepped out, uniform pressed despite the dust, his movements efficient, practiced. The kind that did not waste time on unnecessary gestures. He closed the door with a firm, controlled motion and adjusted his cap as he looked toward the house, then toward the yard, taking everything in without appearing to focus on any one thing. Jack did not move to meet him halfway. He stayed where he was, not out of defiance, but out of position. This was his ground, and he would not step off it without reason. The officer walked forward, boots crunching lightly on gravel, stopping at the base of the porch. "Mr. Turner," he said, his voice even, not raised, not lowered, just formal. Jack nodded once. "That is right." The officer glanced past him briefly, toward the open doorway, toward the table that had not yet been fully cleared, the plates still carrying traces of what had been served. Then his gaze shifted again, this time toward the women standing across the yard, his eyes resting there for a fraction longer, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if something he had been told had just been confirmed. "We have received a report," he continued, his tone unchanged, "about unauthorized interaction between civilian personnel and prisoners of war assigned to this property." The words settled into the air without force, but with weight, the kind that did not need volume to be understood. Behind Jack, one of the men shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting his stance as if the ground beneath him had changed. Jack did not turn, did not acknowledge it, his attention remained on the officer. "What kind of interaction?" he asked, his voice steady, giving nothing away. The officer paused for a brief second, not because he needed time, but because the answer was already decided. "Food preparation," he said. "Shared consumption and a breakdown of established boundaries." He did not raise his voice, did not accuse, he simply stated, each word placed carefully, as if reading from something already written. Jack exhaled once, slow, controlled, his gaze shifting for just a moment toward the yard, toward Anna, who stood without moving, her expression unchanged, not defensive, not withdrawn, just present, and then back to the officer. "They worked," Jack said. "They ate." The officer held his gaze, not challenging, but not yielding either. "They are prisoners," he replied. "Not guests." The sentence landed clean, without emphasis, without anger, but it carried a line through the space that had been built only minutes before, dividing what had just been shared from what was now being enforced, and for a moment, no one spoke. The ranch, the yard, the fading light all holding still around that single distinction, waiting to see which side would remain standing. The word prisoner did not echo, it settled, heavy and precise, like something placed carefully on a table that no one could ignore or move without consequence. Jack did not respond immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood that anything said too quickly would belong to the officer, not to him. The porch creaked softly beneath his weight as he shifted just enough to square himself, not confrontational, not yielding, simply present in a way that made the space his without declaring it. "They worked all day in 100-degree heat," he said after a moment, his voice even. "Same as my men." The officer listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, the kind of stillness that came from practice, from knowing that listening often carried more authority than speaking. "Work assignments are authorized," he replied, "but integration is not." The distinction landed clean, separating action from intention in a way that left little room for interpretation. Behind Jack, one of the cowboys let out a quiet breath, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to be heard by those already listening for it. Across the yard, Anna stood with her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, not on the officer, not on Jack, but somewhere between them. As if the space itself held the answer she would not speak, the officer's eyes moved again, briefly, toward the table inside, the plates, the remaining food, the evidence not of violation, but of something harder to define, something that did not fit neatly into the categories he had been trained to enforce. "Who prepared the meal?" he asked, the question direct, procedural. Jack did not turn this time, did not look back. "She did," he said, his tone unchanged, not shielding, not exposing, simply stating. The officer followed the line of that answer to Anna, his gaze resting on her fully now, assessing, not with hostility, but with the quiet calculation of someone determining where a line had been crossed and whether it could be redrawn. Anna did not move, did not lower her eyes. She stood as she had before, calm, composed, her presence neither defensive nor apologetic, just there. The officer took a step closer to the porch, not enough to close the distance, but enough to narrow it. "You understand," he said, directing his voice now toward her, though still speaking in English, measured and clear, "that prisoners of war are not permitted to engage in unsupervised domestic activity with civilian personnel." Anna listened, the words reaching her not as rules, but as structure, something defined and external. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the smallest movement that still carried weight. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet, but steady enough to carry across the space. The officer held her gaze for a moment longer, then shifted back to Jack. "This arrangement will be reviewed," he said, "and adjustments will be made to ensure compliance." There was no threat in the statement, no raised tone, but the implication was clear enough. The system would correct what it considered deviation, regardless of how it had been experienced by those within it. Jack nodded once, not in acceptance, but in recognition. He had dealt with men like this before, not unkind, not cruel, but bound to something larger than themselves. Something that did not account for what could not be written into orders. The officer stepped back slightly. The conversation, as far as he was concerned, complete, but the space it left behind remained open, unresolved, stretching between the porch and the yard like a line no one could see but everyone could feel. Anna lowered her gaze for the first time, not in defeat, but in thought, as if the moment had passed through her and settled somewhere deeper, and Jack remained where he was, not moving, not speaking. Because he understood something now that had not been clear before. This was never about a meal, and whatever came next would not be there. The officer did not linger after that. He gave a short nod, not of agreement, but of closure, then turned and walked back toward the jeep, his steps measured, each one carrying the quiet authority of someone who had already decided what mattered and what did not. The engine started again with a low mechanical growl that broke the stillness, and as the vehicle pulled away, the dust followed behind it, rising slowly, then drifting apart in the evening air as if the moment itself was dissolving into something less visible but no less real. No one spoke while it left, not on the porch, not in the yard, not among the women standing near the fence. The sound faded, but the space it left behind remained, heavy in a different way now, not uncertain, but defined, like a line drawn without being marked. Jack stayed where he was for a long second after the road went quiet again, his eyes still fixed in the direction the jeep had gone. Then he stepped down from the porch, not quickly, not with urgency, just with purpose, crossing the yard toward the group of women. The men watched him go. None of them following, none of them stopping him, just observing. The same way they had earlier, but now with a different understanding of what that observation meant. Anna did not move when he approached. She stood as she had before, steady, composed, her attention meeting his without hesitation, and for a moment neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because both of them understood that whatever came next would not undo what had already happened. "They will change the rules," Jack said finally, his voice quieter than before, not directed at her alone, but spoken into the space they now shared. Anna nodded once, the motion small, but certain. "Yes," she said. There was no surprise in her tone, no resistance either, just recognition, the kind that comes from knowing how systems work even when you are not part of them. Jack glanced briefly toward the house, toward the table inside that had already been cleared more than usual, then back to her. "You should not have done it," he added, but the words did not carry accusation, they carried something else, something closer to reflection than judgment. Anna held his gaze, steady, unshaken. "It was already wrong," she said, her voice calm. "Before I touched it." Jack did not answer immediately, the sentence settling into him in a way that required time, because he knew she was not speaking only about the food, and that made it harder to dismiss. Across the yard, one of the other women shifted slightly, her hands tightening together for just a second before relaxing again, the small movement enough to show that the moment was not contained to just two people, it belonged to all of them now. The ranch itself seemed quieter, the usual sounds softened, as if even the land was adjusting to what had been said without being fully understood. Jack exhaled slowly, looking past Anna for a moment, toward the horizon where the last light had nearly faded, then back again. "They will watch closer," he said. Anna did not respond right away, she simply stood there, then after a second, she spoke. "Then we will be careful." The words were simple, but they did not carry fear, they carried intention, and that made them different. Jack studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once, not as an order, not as permission, but as acknowledgement, the kind that recognized something had already shifted beyond control. And as he turned back toward the house, the distance between what had been allowed and what would now be enforced felt smaller, but clearer, like a boundary that had not existed before, but now could not be ignored. And behind him, Anna remained where she stood, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just holding that same quiet presence, as if the standard had already been set, and whether it was followed or not no longer belonged to her alone. Morning came without announcement, the light rising slowly over the flat Texas land, turning dust into gold and shadows into something softer. But the ranch did not wake the same way it had the day before. There was a difference now, not visible in the buildings or the fields, but in the way people moved through them, more measured, more aware, as if every step carried an extra weight that had not been there before. The men gathered near the barn earlier than usual, not talking much, their voices lower, their eyes drifting occasionally toward the road as if expecting something to return even when it had already gone. Jack stood near the fence line, hat in hand, looking out across the pasture but not seeing the cattle, his attention fixed somewhere else entirely, the kind of stillness that meant he was thinking through something that could not be solved with tools or routine. Across the yard, the women stepped out one by one, their formation looser than before, but their posture unchanged. They moved toward their assigned work without needing instruction, without hesitation, but there was a quiet coordination between them now, a shared understanding that had not needed words to form. Anna walked slightly behind the others, not leading, not following, just present in that same steady way, her hands already occupied with the morning task, her attention focused, but not closed, as if she was aware of everything around her without needing to look directly at it. The work began as it always did. The rhythm of labor settling in, tools lifting, soil turning, the low sounds of effort blending into the morning air, but beneath it, something else remained, a subtle shift in how space was held, how distance was measured. One of the cowboys approached the water barrel, filling a metal cup and drinking deeply, then without speaking, he set another cup beside it, not offering it directly, not making eye contact, just leaving it there before walking away. One of the women noticed, paused for a brief second, then stepped forward and took it, her movement quiet, deliberate, as if acknowledging something without drawing attention to it. No one commented, no one needed to. The action itself carried enough meaning. Jack saw it from where he stood, his gaze resting there for a moment longer than necessary, then shifting away, not to ignore it, but to allow it to exist without interference. The boundaries had not disappeared, but they had changed shape, less rigid, more defined by choice than by rule. Later, as the sun climbed higher and the heat settled in, the work slowed. Just enough to allow breath, Anna moved toward the shade near the barn, wiping her hands on a cloth, her movements as precise as before, and when she reached for a tool left leaning against the wall, she adjusted it slightly, correcting its balance without thinking, the kind of small action that spoke of habit, of care, of a standard that did not depend on who was watching. Jack noticed that too, not because it stood out, but because it fit. Because it aligned with something he had not named the night before but now recognized clearly. This was not about rules being broken, it was about something else being introduced, something that did not announce itself, did not demand space, but changed the way space was used simply by existing within it. The ranch continued, the work carried on, but the silence between people had shifted, no longer empty, no longer avoiding, but holding something steady, something that did not need to be explained to be understood. And as the day moved forward, the distance between what was required and what was chosen became clearer, not larger, not smaller, just more visible. Like a line drawn not to divide, but to reveal where people decided to stand. By late afternoon the heat had settled into everything, the wood of the fences, the metal of the tools, the air itself carrying that slow, steady weight that made every movement deliberate. But the ranch no longer felt the same as it had the day before. Not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had been set into place and had not left. Jack stood near the edge of the field, watching the workers finish their last rows, his gaze moving not across the land, but across the people within it, noticing the pauses, the small adjustments, the quiet exchanges that required no permission and left no trace except in the way they altered the space between one person and another. One of the cowboys passed a bundle of cloth toward the water barrel, not handing it directly, just placing it where it would be found, and a moment later one of the women used it without looking up, the action simple, almost invisible, but it carried the same weight as the meal from the night before, not an act of defiance, not a challenge to authority, but a choice, steady and unannounced. Anna worked near the fence line, her movements unchanged, consistent, as if nothing had happened at all. But that was not true. Something had happened, and it had settled into her the same way it had settled into the rest of the ranch, not loud, not dramatic, just present. When the work ended and the tools were set down, no one rushed away. The men lingered for a moment longer than usual. The women did the same, not gathering in groups, not speaking across lines that had been drawn, but sharing the same space in a way that no longer felt accidental. Jack removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair, his eyes lifting toward the horizon where the light had begun to soften again. Another day closing in the same way it always did, but not the same at all. He turned slightly, his gaze finding Anna without effort, as if she had become a fixed point in the landscape, something constant that did not demand attention but held it anyway. She sensed it, not by looking directly, but by the shift in the air. And after a moment she turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. No words passed between them, none were needed. The understanding had already been built in smaller moments, in actions that had not asked to be noticed but had been. Jack gave a small nod, not as an order, not as approval, but as acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. Anna returned the nod just as slightly, her expression calm, unchanged, but her presence carrying the same quiet certainty it had from the beginning. Around them, the ranch moved forward, the day closing, the night preparing to take its place, and somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the fences, the system that had tried to define them all continued as it always would, structured, controlled, certain of its boundaries. But here, within this space, something else had taken root, something that did not replace the rules, did not break them in any visible way, but changed how they were held, how they were understood, and how they were lived. Jack turned back toward the house, his steps steady, the weight on his shoulders no lighter, but clearer, and Anna remained where she was for a moment longer before walking back toward the others, her pace unchanged, her posture the same, but the standard she carried now no longer hers alone. It had moved beyond her, into the room, into the work, into the silence between people, and it stayed there, not because it was allowed, but because it had already been chosen. And long after the last light faded and the ranch fell quiet, that choice remained, unseen, unspoken, but impossible to return from, because she had not raised her voice, she had raised the standard.